Before he was known as a skilled blacksmith, before anyone dared whisper of royal blood in his veins, Gendry was simply another boy of Flea Bottom, a nameless shadow in the bustling, foul-smelling underbelly of King's Landing. Born to a mother who worked at an alehouse and a father he never met, Gendry's life began in obscurity. But hidden within that anonymity was a truth that, if recognized and acted upon, could have shaken the foundations of the Seven Kingdoms. He was the unacknowledged son of King Robert Baratheon. From the moment he was old enough to hold a hammer, Gendry displayed remarkable strength and determination. He was apprenticed to Tobo Mott, the city's most skilled and respected armorer, known for crafting fine blades for lords and kings. Mott had little interest in gossip, but he took note of the boy's natural talent, and the patron who paid double the normal apprenticeship fee to ensure Gendry received proper training. That patron, we later learned, was none other than Jon Arryn, the hand of the king at the time. Arryn knew what few did. Robert's bastards were scattered across Westeros, and though most were insignificant to the politics of the realm, Gendry was different. The resemblance between father and son was uncanny. Gendry's broad chest, powerful arms, dark hair, and blue eyes mirrored the youthful Robert, who had once swung a warhammer on the trident and shattered Rhaegar Targaryen's breastplate. Even without a royal upbringing, Gendry carried himself with a quiet pride and an innate sense of fairness, traits that could have served as the foundation for a future ruler. The tragedy was that Gendry himself was unaware of his bloodline, and those who knew had no interest in telling him, at least not while Robert lived. Flea Bottom, however, was a crucible of hardship. The constant struggle for food, the stench of open sewers, and the ever-present threat of thieves and cutthroats forged Gendry into someone tough, resourceful, and self-reliant. Unlike the pampered lords of the Red Keep, Gendry understood suffering firsthand. He had felt the hunger gnaw at his stomach, seen friends die from sickness without a maester's care, and learned early that life was often cruel and unfair. These experiences gave him a perspective no other claimant to the Iron Throne would have possessed. The empathy and grit of a man shaped by the struggles of the Smallfolk. Unbeknownst to Gendry, his existence was both a potential threat and a potential asset in the political chess game of Westeros. For Robert, his bastards were an afterthought, tokens of his many affairs, reminders of a life lived in excess. But for others, especially those who understood the value of legitimacy and bloodlines, a strong and popular Baratheon heir could be a rallying point. If Robert had acknowledged him, or if Jon Arryn had lived long enough to bring the matter to light, Gendry might have been legitimized during Robert's reign. That single act would have instantly placed him ahead of Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella in the line of succession, as the Lannister children had no true Baratheon blood. But Robert's death changed everything. With Jon Arryn gone, the few who knew Gendry's parentage either had their own agendas or feared the consequences of revealing it. Cersei Lannister, desperate to protect her children's illegitimate claim, moved swiftly to eliminate every bastard of Robert she could find. The City Watch, under orders, began a systematic purge, from the baby Bara in her mother's arms to older children hidden in back rooms. Gendry's survival was sheer chance and a stroke of destiny. It was Arryn of the Night's Watch who saved him, slipping him out of King's Landing disguised as a recruit bound for the Wall. This act, though intended to protect the boy from Lannister assassins, also removed him from the political heart of the realm. In that moment, Gendry's potential to claim his birthright was both preserved and delayed. Had he remained in the city, his life might have been cut short before he could wield a hammer in battle or learn the truth of his blood. As he traveled north with the ragtag band of Night's Watch recruits, Gendry remained blissfully unaware of the larger forces at work. To him, the world was still defined by the weight of steel in his hands and the next meal in his stomach. Yet even then, the qualities of a leader were beginning to emerge. He looked out for those weaker than himself, stood up to bullies, and refused to be intimidated by those who tried to assert dominance through fear. His bond with Arya Stark, then disguised as a boy, would prove a turning point in his life. A connection to the Stark family that, had circumstances aligned, might have become a cornerstone of his political legitimacy. Looking back, it's easy to see the outlines of an alternative history, one where Gendry's royal blood was revealed early, where he was taken under the wing of powerful allies, and where his connection to both the nobility and the common people made him a unifying figure in the chaos that followed Robert's death. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of the Baratheon ideal, strong, direct and unpretentious, yet capable of inspiring loyalty. His hands may have been calloused from years at the forge, but those same hands could have held the reins of power with a steadiness few in the Game of Thrones could match. In the end, Gendry's early life was a paradox. His anonymity kept him alive, but it also kept him from his destiny. The boy in the forge, hammer ringing against steel, was a king in waiting without knowing it, a rightful heir hidden in plain sight, biding his time until fate, or perhaps his own choices, would put him in a position to claim the crown that was his by blood. The death of King Robert Baratheon marked the beginning of one of the most ruthless and calculated cover-ups in Westerosi history. To the Smallfolk, the transition from Robert to his supposed son Joffrey seemed swift, if not entirely smooth. But beneath the surface, an ugly truth was taking root, a truth Cersei Lannister would do anything to keep hidden. None of her children had a drop of Baratheon blood. They were all born of incest with her twin brother Jaime, their claim to the Iron Throne resting entirely on deception and the force of Lannister power. Jon Arryn had died for uncovering this secret, and Eddard Stark would meet a similar fate for trying to act on it. But there was another danger to Cersei's web of lies, the living proof of Robert's virility, scattered across the Seven Kingdoms in the form of his illegitimate children. As long as any of these bastards lived, the Lannister claim was vulnerable. It wasn't just about the bloodline, it was about perception. A living son of Robert, especially one who bore his unmistakable features, could become a rallying point for rebels, dissenters and anyone who despised Lannister rule. So Cersei acted decisively. With Robert dead, she issued quiet but lethal orders to the City Watch. Find every known bastard of the late king and kill them. No trial, no questioning, simply erase them from the world before anyone could use them as a pawn. The Gold Cloaks moved with frightening efficiency, starting in King's Landing itself. Some deaths were quick and quiet, hidden in the alleys and shadows. Others were public enough to send a chilling message. Baby Bora, born to a woman who worked in one of the city's alehouses, was murdered in her crib, a small bundle of innocence snuffed out by the cold hands of power. Older bastards, those who worked in trades or as apprentices, were hunted down at their places of work. Every one of them, no matter how harmless, was treated as a potential threat to the Iron Throne. Gendry was very much on that list. His apprenticeship under Tobo Mott had made him visible. He was not just another nameless orphan in the streets. Mott was no fool. When the Gold Cloaks came asking about Robert's bastards, he recognized the danger immediately. Though he was loyal to the crown in name, Mott's loyalty to his craft, and perhaps to the gold Jon Arryn had paid him years before, gave him pause. Instead of handing Gendry over, he stalled, keeping the boy in the shop while deciding how best to remove him from the city without drawing suspicion. The solution arrived in the form of Yoren, a grizzled recruiter for the Night's Watch. Yoren's visits to the capital were not uncommon. He came to gather new recruits from the dungeons and the streets, taking men who had nowhere else to go and sending them to the wall. This time, however, he came with more than just petty criminals in mind. Yoren had promised Eddard Stark, before his execution, that he would protect two individuals, Arya Stark, who was disguised as a boy to escape capture, and Gendry, whose royal blood put him in grave danger. Yoren bundled Gendry into the group of recruits with little explanation. One day he was in Mott's forge, hammering out fine steel. The next he was trudging north on the King's Road, surrounded by thieves, poachers and drunks. For Gendry, the change was abrupt and confusing. He had no idea why the Gold Cloaks were asking about him, or why Tobo Mott seemed so eager to get him out of the city. All he knew was that the air in King's Landing had turned dangerous, and the streets he had once known now felt like traps waiting to be sprung. The journey north was grueling, and the group's composition made it perilous. These were not trained guards or loyal retainers. They were men desperate enough to take the black to escape their crimes. Fights broke out, food was scarce, and the cold nights tested everyone's endurance. Gendry, however, was built for hardship. His years in Flea Bottom and the Forge had given him stamina and a tolerance for discomfort. While others complained or schemed, he kept moving, kept working, and kept his eyes open. Unbeknownst to him, Lannister agents were not far behind. The Gold Cloaks pursued the group, stopping at inns and villages along the way, asking pointed questions about a tall, muscular boy with dark hair and blue eyes. They carried a royal warrant, but their orders were whispered. Bring him back could mean many things, and none of them were good for Gendry. When they finally caught up, it was only Yoren's quick thinking and willingness to draw steel that saved the recruits from capture. The encounter revealed something crucial about Gendry's character. Even without knowing the stakes, he refused to be cowed. When the gold cloaks tried to single him out, he stood firm, challenging them to explain why they wanted him. His defiance in the face of authority was pure Robert Baratheon, blunt, unyielding, and rooted in a deep sense of self-worth. This moment, small though it may have seemed, was a glimpse of the kind of ruler he could have been, a man unwilling to bow to intimidation, even when the odds were against him. By the time the group turned off the main road and headed into the Riverlands, Gendry had unknowingly passed through the most dangerous phase of his flight. The purge of the bastards in King's Landing continued, but in the chaos of the War of the Five Kings, Lannister attention was increasingly divided. Gendry, now far from the capital, faded from their immediate priority list, not because he was safe, but because other fires demanded their focus. And yet his survival was more than just luck. It was the result of quick decisions, hidden alliances, and the willingness of certain individuals to take great risks on his behalf. Yoren's intervention not only spared his life, but set him on a path where he would meet people who could shape his future. Arya Stark, the Brotherhood without banners, and later, figures who might have helped him claim his place in the political order of Westeros. Had Gendry fallen during the Purge, his story would have ended as quietly as it began. Another nameless casualty in the brutal Game of Thrones. But survival, as every player in that game knows, is the first victory. It is the foundation upon which all other ambitions are built. For Gendry, living through Cersei's Purge was the first step toward a destiny he had yet to even imagine. The chance to one day take the crown that was his by right. In Westeros, blood may open the door to acclaim, but alliances keep it from being slammed shut. A royal lineage, especially one as undeniable as Gendry's, is only the beginning. Without support from powerful houses and influential figures, even the truest heir can find himself powerless. For Gendry to claim his birthright, the foundation of his strategy would have needed to be the careful, deliberate building of alliances. And while the young blacksmith lacked political training, his unique background gave him opportunities that a more traditional noble might never have had. The first and most natural alliance Gendry could have forged was with House Stark. His bond with Arya began on the road north, with Yoren's recruits, and though neither knew the full truth of his parentage at the time, the seeds of trust were planted early. Arya respected his strength, his honesty, and his refusal to bend to anyone's will. In a political sense, this was invaluable. The Stark name commanded loyalty across the north and even in parts of the Riverlands. If Gendry had eventually revealed his heritage to Arya, and if Arya had lived to reunite with her family, it's conceivable that House Stark might have thrown their weight behind his claim. The logic for such an alliance was sound. The Starks despised the Lannisters, and would have had every reason to support a legitimate Baratheon heir over the false claim of Joffrey and Tommen. Moreover, Robert Baratheon had been Eddard Stark's closest friend and ally during Robert's rebellion. Backing Robert's true son could have been framed not just as good politics, but as fulfilling a personal oath to Robert's memory. In this alternate history, Gendry could have stood before the bannermen of the North, not as a blacksmith, but as Robert's blood, the man with the legal and moral right to wear the crown. Beyond the Starks, Gendry had the potential to secure support from the Brotherhood without banners, the outlaw group led by Beric Dondarrion and later Thoros of. During his time with them, Gendry's sense of justice aligned well with their mission, protecting the Smallfolk from the depredations of the warring lords. While the Brotherhood lacked the vast armies of noble houses, their influence in the Riverlands was significant, and their moral authority among commoners was unmatched. A king who emerged from their ranks could have enjoyed the rare combination of noble legitimacy and grassroots popularity. Another key avenue was the Stormlands, House Baratheon's ancestral stronghold. At the time of Robert's death, the Stormlands were fractured. Stannis and Renly both claimed the throne, leaving their bannermen divided. However, many of these lords were old enough to remember Robert in his youth, and Gendry's striking resemblance to his father would have been a powerful symbol. If Gendry had been legitimized by a recognized authority, Stannis being the most likely, the Stormlords could have rallied behind him as a unifying figure, one who carried the Baratheon name without the divisive baggage of Stannis's stern religiosity or Renly's perceived frivolity. The Reach also presented a possibility. The Tyrells were political pragmatists, willing to shift allegiances when it served their interests. If Gendry had gained the Stormlands and northern support, the Tyrells might have seen him as a safer bet than the Lannisters, especially if he could secure a marriage alliance. Imagine a union between Gendry and Margaery Tyrell, a match that would bind the wealth and food of the Reach to the strength of Baratheon blood and the loyalty of the North. In the chessboard of Westeros, that combination could have forced the Lannisters into a defensive position. The Martells of Dorne, while more distant, could also have been approached under the right circumstances. Their hatred of the Lannisters for the death of Elia Martell and her children ran deep, and they had little love for the Baratheons who supplanted the Targaryen. But Gendry's common-born upbringing might have made him more relatable to their sense of outsider identity, and his potential willingness to address Dorne's grievances could have opened the door to at least a non-aggression pact. Perhaps the most intriguing potential alliance lay across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen. At first glance, the idea of a Baratheon-Targaryen alliance might seem impossible, given Robert's rebellion and the Targaryen exile. But Daenerys' reign, if she were to take the Iron Throne, would require stabilizing the realm, and the Stormlands, fiercely loyal to the Baratheon name, would be a constant source of unrest, unless she had their loyalty. Gendry, as a legitimized Baratheon, could have offered exactly that. In an alternate world, a political marriage between Daenerys and Gendry could have united two rival houses into a single royal family, healing old wounds and creating a dynasty strong enough to end the cycle of war. These alliances, however, could not have been built on bloodline alone. Gendry would have needed to actively cultivate relationships, something far outside his comfort zone, as a straightforward and plain-spoken man. This is where skilled advisors would have been essential. Figures like Davos Seaworth, who understood both politics and the perspective of commoners, could have acted as intermediaries, helping Gendry navigate the treacherous waters of noble courts without losing the authenticity that made him appealing. At the heart of these strategies was the recognition that Gendry's greatest strength was his dual identity. He was both the son of a king and a man of the people. In a realm weary of noble excess, war, and betrayal, this combination could have been revolutionary. Lords could rally to his legitimate claim. Small folk could see him as one of their own. His hammer, once used only to forge steel, could become a symbol, a reminder that he had worked with his hands, that he knew the weight of labor, and that he would not sit idle while his subjects suffered. If these alliances had been methodically pursued, North, Stormlands, Riverlands, through the Brotherhood, Reach through marriage, Dorne through diplomacy, and possibly even Essos, through Daenerys, Gendry's claim to the Iron Throne could have shifted from an improbable dream to a genuine threat to the Lannister hold on power. And in the ever-shifting balance of Westerosi politics, once momentum begins to build, it often becomes unstoppable. In the Seven Kingdoms, the right to rule is not determined solely by who wields the sword or commands the largest army. Tradition, law, and precedent carry enormous weight, and in a realm obsessed with the sanctity of noble bloodlines, lineage is as sharp a weapon as any blade. For Gendry, his strongest card in the Game of Thrones was not his skill with a warhammer, or his popularity with the common folk, but his blood. He was the son of Robert Baratheon, the very man who had taken the Iron Throne by force and ruled for nearly 2 decades. If his parentage could be proven and legitimized, his claim would be far more valid than that of any Lannister or pretender. To understand the strength of Gendry's potential claim, we have to examine the legal traditions of Westeros regarding bastards. Illegitimate children, no matter how noble their blood, are not automatically entitled to inherit lands or titles. They are viewed as outside the line of succession, often treated as social inconveniences or political liabilities. And yet there exists a well-established legal mechanism that could change everything: legitimization by royal decree. In the eyes of the law, a monarch has the absolute authority to declare a bastard legitimate. This act is not symbolic. It is binding, erasing the legal stain of illegitimacy and placing the newly legitimized heir directly into the line of succession. There are precedents for this throughout Westerosi history. One of the most famous examples was Ramsay Snow, the bastard of Rose Bolton, who was legitimized by King Tommen Baratheon during the War of the Five Kings. Once legitimized, Ramsay inherited the Dreadfort and became Ramsay Bolton. If even a king as weak and manipulated as Tommen could grant legitimacy to a sadistic Bolton, then a politically capable ruler could have done the same for Gendry. The most likely candidate to legitimize Gendry would have been Stannis Baratheon. Stannis, as Robert's brother and the legal heir after Robert's death, once Joffrey's illegitimacy was proven, was a man obsessed with law and rightful claim. For all his rigidity, Stannis was pragmatic enough to see the value in consolidating the Baratheon line. By legitimizing Gendry, Stannis could have secured the loyalty of the Stormlords, given himself a potential successor, and created a figure who could appeal to the common people in ways he himself could not. Davos Seaworth, Stannis's most trusted advisor, even tried to persuade him to spare Gendry's life when Melisandre wanted to sacrifice him, a moment that hinted at the possibilities if politics had outweighed prophecy. In the alternate scenario where Stannis legitimizes Gendry, the Lannisters' legal foundation crumbles. Once Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella's true parentage was exposed, their claims would be rendered null under both law and custom. The line of succession would then pass to Robert's trueborn heirs, of which Gendry, if legitimized, would be the only one. This isn't speculation, it's black and white Westerosi inheritance law. And the great irony is that Cersei's purge of Robert's bastards was an unspoken admission of this very danger. Beyond Stannis, there was another potential legitimizing force, Daenerys Targaryen. Upon taking the throne, Daenerys could have declared Gendry legitimate as part of a political bargain, using him to stabilize the Stormlands and bridge the gap between the old Robert loyalists and her Targaryen. Such a move would echo the early days of Aegon the Conqueror, who used marriage alliances and legitimization to pacify rivals and solidify rule. Daenerys, always in need of allies from Westerosi noble houses, might have recognized the strategic brilliance of turning Robert's son into her loyal vassal, or even her husband. The process of legitimization would not have been without challenge. First, proof of Gendry's parentage would have needed to be established beyond reasonable doubt. While his physical resemblance to Robert was compelling, Westeros demanded more than just appearance. Witnesses would have been key. Topo Mott, who received double payment from Jon Arryn for Gendry's apprenticeship, could have testified. Euron could have provided an account of the Gold Cloak's pursuit of the boy under Cersei's order. Even members of Robert's old court might have recalled the king mentioning his strong son in the city. With multiple voices corroborating the truth, the case for his bloodline would have been nearly impossible to refute. Second, there would have been the matter of political buy-in from the realm's major houses. While legitimization is a royal prerogative, its acceptance is ultimately enforced through the support or fear of the Lord. A king could declare anyone legitimate, but if the great houses refused to recognize that legitimacy, the decree would be meaningless. This is why timing and alliances, as discussed in the previous section, would have been crucial. The best moment for Gendry's legitimization would have been during a period of Lannister weakness, perhaps after the death of Tywin Lannister, or during the instability caused by the Faith militants' rise in King's Landing. There's also an emotional component to the right of legitimacy. Is not just about the law, it's about recognition. For the Stormlords, many of whom had fought under Robert during the rebellion, seeing his son, a man who looked and fought like him, declared the rightful heir would have stirred loyalty far deeper than any written decree. The Smallfolk, meanwhile, might have been inspired by the idea that one of their own, a man who had worked in the forges and lived among them, was now acknowledged as a king. This combination of noble duty and popular affection is rare in Westeros, and it would have made Gendry's claim far stronger than that of most pretenders. Of course, the greatest obstacle to Gendry's claim by blood was ignorance, his own and that of the people around him. Without knowing who he truly was, he could not press his claim, and without powerful allies willing to risk challenging the Lannisters, the truth of his birth could not be elevated into a political weapon. In the brutal calculus of the Game of Thrones, truth only matters when it is wielded with strategy. In a world where Stannis lived longer, where Davos had the political room to maneuver, and where the North and Stormlands could have been brought into alignment, Gendry's right of blood might not only have been recognized, It could have been the rallying cry that ended Lannister rule once and for all. The legal precedent was there. The moral argument was there. All that remained was the will to. In the deadly politics of Westeros, the great lords often forget one inconvenient truth. The majority of the realm is not made up of knights, lords and ladies. It is made up of the small folk, farmers, craftsmen, fishers, soldiers, merchants, and beggars. The faceless masses who till the fields, fill the markets, and bleed in the wars of their betters. To most kings, they are little more than a background presence, a resource to be taxed or conscripted. But to Gendry, they were his people, because before anything else, he was one of them. No claimant to the Iron Throne in living memory had such a direct and personal connection to the lives of the common folk. He wasn't born in a castle, wasn't raised on the soft cushions of a highborn nursery, and wasn't shielded from hardship by guards or maesters. Gendry had slept on a straw mattress in a dingy room over an alehouse. He had walked through the reeking mud of Flea Bottom every day, breathing in the stench of waste and smoke. He had worked with his hands from the time he was old enough to hold a hammer, sweating over the forge while noblemen ordered armor and weapons they would never craft themselves. This background, far from being a weakness, could have been Gendry's greatest political strength, the thing that set him apart from every other contender for the crown. The people of Westeros were accustomed to rulers who saw them as expendable, who sent them to war without a thought and taxed them into poverty. But a king who truly understood their struggles, who had eaten the same stale bread and feared the same winter hunger, that was something unheard of. Had Gendry actively pursued his birthright, winning the small folk's heart would not have been difficult. His story alone was enough to inspire the bastard son of a king, raised as a blacksmith, who rose to claim his place not through privilege but through perseverance and merit. In the taverns of King's Landing and the market stalls of Old Town, such a story would have spread like wildfire. The Brotherhood without banners offered a perfect conduit for this kind of popular support. Operating in the Riverlands, they were already seen as champions of the common people, fighting against the injustices of the great lords. If Gendry had become their figurehead, not just as a fighter, but as the rightful king, the Brotherhood could have transformed into a grassroots political movement, rallying not only the dispossessed of the Riverlands, but small folk across the realm. Imagine a king whose first soldiers were not knights sworn to ancient houses, but farmers, millers and innkeepers who saw him as their own. Public image matters in Westeros, and Gendry had the perfect visual symbolism to win hearts. Unlike other claimants, he didn't need silk and gold to project authority. His broad shoulders, calloused hands, and straightforward demeanor were proof enough of his authenticity. In an age where noble hypocrisy was the norm, his plain-spoken honesty would have been refreshing. He could walk into a village and speak to its people, without needing an interpreter for the realities of their lives. That is a rare and dangerous quality in a ruler, dangerous to his enemies, because it creates loyalty that can't be. Of course, popularity among the small folk isn't enough on its own to win the Iron Throne. Armies still need lords to command them, food still needs to be supplied, and sieges still require castles to hold out in. But in a realm as fractured as Westeros during the War of the Five Kings, the support of the people could have been a game-changing advantage. It would have made it harder for rivals to paint Gendry as a usurper or pretender. Even if the great lords scoffed, they could not ignore the will of tens of thousands of commoners, ready to rise in his name. Consider the precedent of Robert's rebellion. While it was led by lords, it was fueled in part by the anger of the realm at the Targaryens, and Robert's charisma with both nobles and soldiers played a major role in that war's success. Gendry had inherited his father's natural presence, but without the arrogance and excess that came with Robert's royal upbringing. He could have harnessed that charisma in a more disciplined, sustainable way, turning it into a long-term political asset, rather than a fleeting burst of popularity. Winning the hearts of the small folk also carries strategic advantages in wartime. Villages can choose to shelter or betray armies, to hide food stores or reveal them. Commoners can spread information or misinformation that can help or hinder a claimant's cause. In a war fought across such a vast and politically diverse land, having the small folk on your side means controlling the very roads your enemies must march on. It means knowing where their supply lines run, and having willing saboteurs ready to disrupt them. In essence, it turns the entire countryside into an extension of your army. Gendry's campaign to win this loyalty could have been simple but effective. Visiting market towns, breaking bread with villagers, hearing their grievances in person, actions no highborn lord would bother with, would have made a powerful statement. Small gestures, like funding repairs to a village well or ensuring fair prices for blacksmith work, would have built a reputation that spread far faster than Lannister gold ever could. The more the people saw him as their king, the harder it would have been for any rival to dislodge him. And finally, there's the moral dimension. In a realm ravaged by endless cycles of war, famine, and betrayal, the people longed for a ruler who would not see them as pawns. Gendry, forged in the same fires of hardship as they were, could have been that ruler, not out of some idealized notion of justice, but because he knew from personal experience what it meant to go hungry, to be powerless, and to live at the mercy of distant lords. That knowledge, if wielded wisely, could have been the cornerstone of a new kind of kingship, one that ruled with the people, not merely over them. In the Game of Thrones, hearts are often harder to win than castles. But for Gendry, it was one battle he was uniquely equipped to fight, and legitimacy and popularity might set the stage for a king, but in Westeros, a claim without an army is like a sword without a blade. It looks impressive until you need to use it. No matter how compelling Gendry's heritage or how beloved he was by the Smallfolk, to truly challenge the entrenched powers of the realm, he would have needed hard military strength. In this regard, the Stormlands, the ancestral domain of House Baratheon, offered the perfect foundation. The Stormlands were no mere backwater. They were a proud and war-hardened region, forged by centuries of struggle against both invaders and the relentless storms from which they take their name. Geographically, they are a fortress in themselves, a rugged, coastal region with mountains, dense forests, and narrow, easily defended passes. To the east lies Shipbreaker Bay, a treacherous stretch of water infamous for its deadly tempests. To the north, the Stormlands border the Crownlands, putting them in striking distance of King's Landing. And at the center of it all is Storm's End, the seat of House Baratheon, one of the most formidable castles in all the Seven Kingdoms. Storm's End was built for war. Its massive curtain wall, constructed by the legendary Bran the Builder and reinforced over the centuries, has never been taken by siege. It withstood the might of the Reach during Robert's rebellion, when Mace Tyrell's armies encircled it for an entire year without breaching its defenses. Whoever holds Storm's End holds a near impregnable stronghold, a launch point for both defense and offense. For Gendry, claiming Storm's End would have been both a symbolic and strategic masterstroke, a declaration that the Baratheon line still held its ancient seat, and a tangible base of operations for his bid for the Iron Throne. The key to seizing Storm's End would have been the loyalty of the Stormlords, the noble houses sworn to House Baratheon. Many of these houses, such as House Cairn of Nightsong, House Selmy of Harvest Hall, and House Dondarrion of Blackhaven, had deep ties to Robert's cause during the rebellion. They had fought alongside him at the Trident, and they remembered the days when a Baratheon sat on the throne without Lannister manipulation. If Gendry had approached them not as a distant king demanding loyalty, but as Robert's own flesh and blood returning to his rightful place, he could have reawakened that loyalty. This is where timing would have been crucial. After Robert's death, the Stormlands were fractured between Stannis and Renly. Renly's assassination left many lords leaderless, and Stannis's departure to the Wall created a vacuum. If Gendry had stepped forward during this period, especially with Stannis's legitimization, he could have positioned himself as the unifying figure the Stormlords desperately needed. Once in control of the Stormlands, Gendry's military potential would have expanded rapidly. The region could field tens of thousands of soldiers, seasoned knights, hardened infantry, and skilled archers, all accustomed to the rough terrain and brutal weather of their homeland. In addition, the Stormlands boast a capable fleet, smaller than the Ironborns, but perfectly suited for operations along the southern and eastern coasts. From Storm's End, Gendry could launch naval raids against the Crownlands, disrupt Lannister supply lines into King's Landing, and even coordinate with sympathetic forces in Dorne or the Reach. Holding the Stormlands would also provide access to crucial resources. The forests could supply endless timber for ships and siege engines. The mines and forges could produce weapons and armor at a pace few regions could match, and here Gendry's own background as a master armorer would give him an advantage. Imagine a king who not only commanded his smiths, but understood their craft, who could personally inspect the blades going into his soldiers' hands and know their worth. That level of personal investment would inspire loyalty among his troops in ways no distant pampered ruler could replicate. Another overlooked advantage of the Stormlands is their strategic geography in multi-front warfare. From Storm's End, Gendry could pressure King's Landing directly to the north, but also move westward into the Reach, undermining Lannister-Tyrell alliance. To the south, he could reach across the Boneway into Dorne, opening the possibility of an alliance with the Martell. In a drawn-out conflict, controlling the Stormlands would allow him to dictate the terms of engagement, forcing his enemies to either attack heavily fortified positions or risk leaving him unchallenged in their. A Stormlands-based army would not just be a military asset, it would be a symbolic reminder that the Baratheons were not gone. In war, symbolism matters as much as steel. The sight of the crowned black stag banners flying again from the battlements of Storm's End would send a message to every lord and commoner alike. Robert's line still endures, and it is ready to fight. That kind of morale boost could ripple far beyond the Stormlands, drawing recruits from across Westeros who had grown disillusioned with Lannister rule. Of course, the challenge would have been getting the Stormlords to commit in the first place. Many of them had been burned by the chaos of the War of the Five Kings and were reluctant to gamble on another claimant. Gendry's task would have been to convince them that his cause was different, that it wasn't about personal ambition, but about restoring stability and justice to the realm. Here, his combination of rightful blood, common touch, and unifying vision could have tipped the scales. In the end, armies win battles, but safe harbors and secure fortresses win wars. If Gendry had secured the Stormlands and raised its banners under his command, he would have gained more than soldiers. He would have gained the legitimacy that comes from holding the seat of his house, the resources to sustain a campaign, and the strategic leverage to make every rival think twice before opposing him. And with Storm's End at his back, the road to King's Landing would have been far shorter and far more certain. If Gendry's path to the Iron Throne had one unavoidable obstacle, it was the same one that had tripped up countless other ambitious men and women in Westeros. The labyrinthine, treacherous, and ever-shifting Game of Thrones. This was not a game fought solely with swords and banners. It was one of whispers, alliances, betrayals, and public perception. To win it, Gendry would have needed more than the strength of his arm or the purity of his claim. He would have needed to become a political player capable of matching, and eventually outmaneuvering, the most cunning minds in the realm. The irony is that Gendry, by nature, was not suited to such games. He was direct, honest, and straightforward, admirable traits for a blacksmith, but dangerous ones for a would-be king in a realm where the truth was often a liability. Yet it was precisely this contrast, his authenticity in a world of liars, that could have been turned into his greatest advantage if handled correctly. The first step in navigating this world would have been building a trusted council. Gendry would have needed shrewd advisors who could operate in the shadows where he could not. Men like Davos Seaworth, who understood the value of honor but also the necessity of compromise, would have been invaluable. Davos's experience in both smuggling and politics gave him a unique insight into how to make deals without losing one's integrity. A figure like Varys, if persuaded that Gendry's reign truly served the realm, could have acted as a master of whispers, countering Lannister spies and feeding disinformation to his enemies. Even Tyrion Lannister, if circumstances aligned, could have been a potential ally, especially if he saw Gendry as a means of breaking Cersei's hold on the throne. One of the most dangerous aspects of Westerosi politics is that loyalty is rarely absolute. Alliances shift with the wind, and promises made one day can be broken the next if the balance of power changes. Gendry would have had to accept that even his closest allies might turn on him if they saw a better opportunity. The key, then, would have been to ensure that backing him was always the better opportunity, that his cause was not only morally compelling, but strategically advantageous. In practice, this means controlling narrative. While the Lannisters ruled through fear and wealth, Gendry could have ruled through legitimacy and trust. This narrative would need to be carefully cultivated through public declarations, symbolic acts, and visible demonstrations of his fitness to rule. For example, publicly rejecting the excesses of court gold-plated armor, extravagant feasts, in favor of a more humble servant of the people image, would have drawn a stark contrast with the corrupt grandeur of the Lannister. At the same time, Gendry could not afford to appear weak or naive. He would have needed to make calculated displays of strength, both on the battlefield and in the council chamber, to remind allies and enemies alike that while he valued honor, he was not a man to be trifled with. In Westeros, a leader who is too merciful is seen as a fool. A leader who is too ruthless loses the love of his people. Walking this knife's edge between justice and strength would have been his greatest personal challenge. Marriage alliances would also play a pivotal role in his political maneuvering. Westeros is a place where a wedding can shift the balance of power as surely as a battle. A union with a powerful house, such as the Tyrells of the Reach, the Martells of Dorne, or even a northern Stark, could secure armies and resources that might otherwise be unavailable. Each option came with risk. A Tyrell match could alienate traditional Baratheon loyalists, wary of Reach influence. A Stark marriage might bind him to northern independence movements. A Martell alliance could complicate relations with the rest of the realm. Gendry's success in this area would hinge on his ability to choose a partner who not only brought military advantage, but also reinforced his image as a unifier, rather than a conqueror. Dealing with rivals would require its own set of strategy. With the Lannisters, the path might be direct confrontation, a military and political campaign to expose their illegitimacy and weaken their grip on the throne. With the Targaryens, should Daenerys return, the situation would be more delicate. A war between two claimants with strong cases could splinter the realm anew. In this scenario, negotiation, mutual recognition, or even a dynastic marriage might have been the wiser course. Gendry would also have needed to be mindful of the faith of the Sept. The High Septon and the Faith Militant could be powerful allies or dangerous enemies. Cersei's missteps with the Faith demonstrated how quickly their favor could turn into a political crisis. Gendry's humble origins and moral credibility could have been used to win the Faith's endorsement, framing him as a king chosen by both blood and the god. A public anointing by the High Septon in the Great Sept of Baelor would have been a powerful legitimizing act, one that even the most skeptical lords would struggle to oppose without appearing to defy both law and religion. Ultimately, navigating the Game of Thrones would not mean abandoning who Gendry was, but learning to weaponize it. His honesty could be a tool to gain trust, his humility a shield against accusations of ambition, and his strength a constant reminder that he could back his words with action. With the right advisors, carefully chosen alliances, and a mastery of public perception, Gendry could have transformed from an outsider in the political arena into its most dangerous player, not because he played by their rules, but because he could redefine them. If Gendry could have struck that balance, remaining the man of the people while learning to survive in the viper's nest of noble intrigue, the Iron Throne would not have been a distant dream. It would have been a seat waiting for him to claim. The Brotherhood without banners began as a small band of loyalists, sent into the Riverlands by Eddard Stark to bring justice to the outlaws, harassing the Smallfolk. But like so many forces in the chaos of the War of the Five Kings, they evolved into something far greater, and far more unconventional. Under the leadership of Lord Beric Dondarrion, a knight once sworn to House Baratheon, and the Red Priest Thoros of Myr, the Brotherhood became a roaming force of justice, unbound by fealty to any one lord or crown. Their purpose was simple: defend the common people from the ravages of war, no matter which banner the perpetrators served. In a realm where nearly every armed company answered to some feuding noble house, the Brotherhood was unique. They answered not to lords, but to an ideal. They were not interested in conquering castles or taxing villages. Their power came from mobility, secrecy, and the loyalty of the Smallfolk in the Riverlands, who sheltered them, guided them, and fed them when needed. They fought a guerrilla war, striking quickly and disappearing before their enemies could mount a response. For Gendry, the Brotherhood was more than a refuge during his travels. It was a blueprint. Here was a fighting force already respected by the people, already armed and organized, and already led by men who had once served his own house. In a different timeline, this could have been the seed of his own rebellion, a loyal core that could be expanded into an army in the name of Robert's trueborn, legitimized son. When Gendry first joined them, He was not yet aware of the full scope of his heritage, nor was he thinking in terms of political ambition. To him, they were simply good men, or at least better than most, doing good work. He admired their cause, fought beside them, and saw firsthand how much the Smallfolk loved them, and they in turn respected him. His blacksmithing skills made him valuable in camp, and his courage in battle won him a place among their rank. Even without the weight of a crown behind him, Gendry was already forging bonds of loyalty with men and women who would have followed him anywhere. But this moment in his life, this rare combination of personal trust and political opportunity, passed without being seized. The Brotherhood saw themselves as neutral arbiters of justice, unwilling to throw their support behind anyone claimant to the throne. Yet their leader, Beric Dondarrion, had once carried Robert's own banner in war. He had been a knight of the Stormlands, appointed by Eddard Stark himself, and had fought for Robert's cause in his youth. These were not men who would have easily sworn to the Lannister. If Gendry had revealed his heritage to Beric and Thoros, and more importantly, if he had a plan to unite the Stormlands and the Riverlands under his cause, the Brotherhood might have reconsidered their neutrality. Their entire ethos was about protecting the common people from corrupt and self-serving rulers. A king who was of the people, yet carried the rightful blood of the Baratheon line, would have embodied their ideal. It's not hard to imagine Thoros, with his flair for the dramatic and his deep respect for the gods' will, proclaiming Gendry as the chosen ruler the realm needed. The Brotherhood's structure was ideal for the early stages of a rebellion. They could move through enemy-controlled territory without detection, rally local support and strike at strategic targets to disrupt Lannister control. Imagine the political message of a series of quick, decisive strikes on Lannister garrisons in the Riverlands, each followed by the raising of the crowned Black Stag banner. Every victory would have been both a military success and a piece of propaganda, spreading the idea that Robert's son was taking back the realm. They also had something most armies lacked: a strong network of informants among the common folk. Every tavern, every mill, every farm in the Riverlands could have become a listening post for Gendry's cause. In the Game of Thrones, knowing where your enemies are, how many men they have, and where they plan to move next is often more valuable than having twice their number. Gendry's own skills could have elevated the Brotherhood's capabilities. As a blacksmith, he could have overseen the creation of superior weapons and armor for their fight. He could have instituted standardization in their gear, turning them from a loose band of irregulars into a disciplined fighting unit that still retained the mobility and unpredictability of guerrilla warfare. Moreover, the Brotherhood's moral authority could have been a powerful counter to the propaganda of the Lannisters. The Riverlands had suffered greatly under the brutality of Gregor Clegane and the constant back and forth of warring armies. If the same outlaws who had defended their villages for years suddenly declared for a rightful king who was one of their own, it would have carried immense weight. Lords might sneer, but the people would rally, and people in great enough numbers can force lords to act. Of course, turning the Brotherhood into the backbone of a rebellion would not have been without its challenges. They valued their independence, and might have been wary of becoming tools of any crown. Gendry would have had to convince them that his reign would not betray their ideals, that he would protect the people not just in words but in action. This would require more than promises. It would require perhaps granting them a formal charter as the people's guard, answerable directly to the king, could have been a compromise, allowing them to keep their mission while tying their loyalty to him. The missed opportunity here is clear. When Gendry eventually left the Brotherhood, it was without a larger purpose or plan. In another version of events, he could have left at the head of their army, their banners flying alongside his own. Instead, he walked away from a ready-made base of power, one that could have been the spark to ignite a realm-wide uprising. The Brotherhood without banners represented something rare in Westeros, a force trusted by the people, untethered to corrupt noble houses, and led by veterans with both experience and moral authority. In the hands of Robert Baratheon's son, they could have been transformed from wandering do-gooders into the vanguard of a revolution. And had that happened, the Lannisters might have found themselves fighting not just another army, but an idea, and ideas, once they catch fire, are far harder to kill than men. If Gendry's path to the Iron Throne was to extend beyond the Stormlands and the Riverlands, there was one alliance that could have reshaped, not just his claim, but the future of the entire realm. An alliance with Daenerys Targaryen. At first glance, the idea seems far-fetched. The Baratheon name was synonymous with the rebellion that toppled her father, and Robert himself had sworn to kill every Targaryen he could find. Yet politics in Westeros has never been about sentiment. It is about power, and the uniting of two claims could have brought stability to a fractured realm in a way that neither Gendry nor Daenerys could achieve alone. From a political standpoint, Gendry and Daenerys were mirror images. She had the last name that could inspire fierce loyalty among the old Targaryen loyalists in the Crownlands and parts of the Reach, as well as the strength of her dragons. He had the Baratheon name, the Stormlands at his back, and if legitimized, the only surviving true-born heir of Robert's line. Each had something the other lacked. For Daenerys, Westeros was a foreign land in which she had no personal allies, no long-standing political network, and no natural claim to the loyalty of the Stormlords, or the Smallfolk who revered Robert. Gendry could have solved all three problems in one move. His name alone could have opened the gates of Storm's End to her cause. His popularity with the Smallfolk would have softened the image of a Targaryen conqueror returning from Essos, and his ability to bridge the divide between commoner and noble could have made her more palatable to those who feared her as a foreign queen with no ties to the land. For Gendry, the advantages were equally profound. Daenerys brought with her not just armies the Unsullied, the freedmen of Essos, and the sellsword companies she could command, but also the most fearsome weapons in the known world, dragons. Even the most hardened Stormlord would have recognized the advantage of uniting with someone who could burn an enemy fleet to ashes in an afternoon. A marriage between Gendry and Daenerys would not only unite their claims but also give them a level of military dominance unseen since Aegon the Conqueror. Strategically, such an alliance could have been framed as the healing of the realm. The Baratheon rebellion had shattered the Targaryen dynasty. A union of Robert's heir and the last Targaryen monarch could have been presented as the final chapter in that bloody history, the moment when two rival houses set aside the past to forge a new future. This narrative would have been powerful propaganda, especially in regions torn between nostalgia for the Targaryens and loyalty to Robert's memory. Of course, there would have been obstacles. Daenerys's advisors, particularly Ser Jorah Mormont and Tyrion Lannister, might have warned her against binding herself to the blood of Robert Baratheon. Likewise, some of Gendry's supporters, especially those who had fought in Robert's rebellion, would have bristled at the idea of allying with the family they had once sought to destroy. The key would have been reframing the union not as a compromise of principle, but as a merging of strengths to end the endless cycle of war. There is also the question of succession politics. Who would sit the Iron Throne in such a marriage? Daenerys had been raised to believe the throne was hers by birthright, while Gendry's legitimized claim as Robert's heir would also be valid under Westerosi law. In practice, this would have required either an agreement of joint rule or the understanding that one would take the throne while the other reigned as consort, both wielding real power behind the scenes. Given Gendry's lack of personal ambition for the trappings of kingship in canon, it's possible he would have been content to share or even cede the symbolic crown in exchange for the stability of their combined rule. If this alliance had been forged early enough, before Daenerys's forces suffered heavy losses in the wars for King's Landing, it could have prevented the destructive final campaigns that left much of the capital in ruin. Instead of arriving as a foreign invader with armies from across the narrow sea, Daenerys could have entered Westeros as the ally and betrothed of its rightful Baratheon heir, welcomed by Storm's End and the Riverlands under the Brotherhood's banner. In such a scenario, even the Reach and Dorne might have joined willingly, seeing the union as a guarantee of peace rather than the beginning of another bloody conquest. There is also the undeniable military chemistry of such a partnership. Gendry, raised in the Stormlands and hardened by both the forge and the battlefield, could have commanded the ground forces, knights, infantry and guerrilla fighters alike, while Daenerys dominated the skies with her dragon. In a coordinated campaign, their enemies would have faced the worst of both worlds: relentless, disciplined pressure on the ground and the terrifying threat of fire from above. On a symbolic level, this alliance would have been a mythmaker's dream. Songs and stories would immortalize the union of stag and dragon, the reconciliation of fire and steel, the imagery of their banners flying side by side, the crowned black stag and the three-headed red dragon, would have been seared into the hearts of Westerosi history. It would have been more than a marriage. It would have been a statement that the realm was finally whole again. But perhaps the greatest benefit of the dragon connection would have been preemptive legitimacy. By standing beside Daenerys from the beginning of her campaign, Gendry could have claimed the throne before the Lannisters had the chance to frame him as a usurper or pretender. Instead of being an outsider trying to insert himself into the war late, he would have been one half of the most formidable power couple Westeros had ever seen. A king and queen whose united claim would be nearly impossible to challenge without looking like a traitor to both houses. The tragedy is that this possibility was never even considered in the events we know. Gendry, unaware of the scope of his heritage until it was too late, never reached across the narrow sea, and Daenerys, focused on her own destiny, never sought an alliance with the Baratheon name. Yet in the vast what-if landscape of Westerosi history, the stag and dragon could have reigned together and perhaps in doing so, spared the realm from much of the fire and blood that followed. History in Westeros is filled with names etched into songs and stories, kings and queens whose victories or failures shaped the fate of the realm. But sometimes, the most fascinating figures are not those who sat the Iron Throne, but those who might have. In that category, few are as intriguing as Gendry, the blacksmith of Flea Bottom, the unacknowledged son of Robert Baratheon, and the man who, under different circumstances, could have been king. When we trace the threads of his life, the picture becomes clear. All the elements for a claim were there. The right of blood, established by his unmistakable Baratheon heritage, could have been cemented through legitimization by a recognized monarch like Stannis or Daenerys. The loyalty of the Stormlands, won through his resemblance to Robert and the revival of Baratheon pride, could have given him a powerful military base. The hearts of the Smallfolk, already drawn to his humble origins and plain-spoken nature, could have provided him with a kind of support that no other claimant in living memory possessed. Even the political chessboard was not entirely stacked against him. The fractured alliances of the War of the Five Kings created openings for an outsider with the right name to step in. The Brotherhood without banners offered a ready-made core of loyal fighters and a grassroots network across the Riverlands. A marriage alliance, perhaps to Margaery Tyrell, Sansa Stark, or even Daenerys Targaryen, could have expanded his legitimacy and turned him into a unifying symbol for the realm. With the right timing, the Black Stag and the Three-Headed Dragon could have flown together over King's Landing, ending the war with a unity the Seven Kingdoms hadn't seen since Aegon's conquest. And yet none of it happened. Part of the reason lies in Gendry's own nature. He was not a man hungry for power. In many ways, that is what would have made him a good king, but in Westeros, it also meant he lacked the ruthless self-promotion necessary to survive in the early stages of a claim. He never sought the crown, never courted lords, never used his resemblance to Robert as a political tool. While others schemed and maneuvered for advantage, Gendry remained focused on the tasks in front of him: survival, craftsmanship, and when the time came, fighting alongside those he trusted. Timing, too, was against him. By the time his heritage was openly acknowledged, the Great Wars were already reaching their final bloody conclusions. The Lannisters had been entrenched in King's Landing for years. Stannis had burned his own path to ruin. The Tyrells had bound themselves to the throne through marriage. And Daenerys's campaign was already reshaping the power balance in ways that left little room for a new claimant to emerge without sparking yet another war. Still, the what-ifs linger. What if Stannis had listened to Davos and legitimized Gendry instead of seeking his death for Melisandre's rituals? What if the Brotherhood without banners had chosen to rally behind Robert's son instead of clinging to political neutrality? What if Gendry had been made Lord of Storm's End years earlier, given the resources to build an army and the platform to press his claim before the Lannisters had solidified their control? It's not hard to imagine the banners rising across the realm. In the Stormlands, the crowned Black Stag flying once more over Storm's End. In the Riverlands, the Brotherhood without banners striking Lannister garrisons under the cry of Baratheon blood for the people's king. In the north, the Starks honoring their old alliance with Robert's house by lending swords to his son. And in King's Landing, the people whispering that the true king had come, not from across the narrow sea, not from a golden hall, but from the forge, hammer in hand, ready to reshape the realm. A Gendry reign would have looked very different from Robert. Where Robert squandered his victory on feasts, hunts, and debts, Gendry's practical nature might have rebuilt the realm's infrastructure, strengthened its defenses, and restored the crown's finances. He would have understood the value of a day's work, the dignity of craft, and the importance of fairness in governance. Perhaps he would not have been a king to inspire grand poetry or dragonfire-fueled legends, but he might have been the king the realm needed: steady, grounded, and incorruptible. and yet the history books of Westeros will never list him among its rulers. Instead, Gendry remains a curiosity, the king who never was. He sits not on a throne of swords, but in the seat of Lord of Storm's End, elevated by Queen Daenerys' successor in a gesture of recognition that came too late for a true claim. To the Smallfolk, he is still remembered fondly as a man of their own who rose higher than anyone expected. To the lords, he is a reminder of the unpredictable currents of lineage and legitimacy. To the realm, he is a ghost of a possibility, a path not taken. But in the taverns and marketplaces, in the quiet conversations far from the ears of kings and queens, the old story is still told. The tale of Robert's son, the blacksmith with the king's blood, who could have united the realm. The man who could have been a great king, if only the winds of fate had blown differently. And perhaps, in those whispered tales, there is still a lesson that sometimes, the worthiest ruler is not the one who fought hardest to claim the throne, but the one who never needed it to be complete.